Hello, you're watching James. My name's James, you're watching me, and I am talking about watches. Well, today I want to talk about the 5 questions that I ask myself every single time I consider buying a watch. Every time I look at a watch and I go, wow, yeah, I like that, maybe I should buy it, I stop, I pause, and I think about 5 questions that I like to run through every single time. And I do that for affordable watches, I do that for sort of not so affordable watches, and especially for watches that cost a fair amount of money. And the reason I ask myself these 5 questions is because I don't have an endless amount of money available to spend on watches. I am predominantly an affordable watch collector. I only can really justify a certain amount of money into that watch collection, and the money that I do spend, I want to spend it well, wisely, and get some really good watches for my collection. And I can only really justify having a certain amount of watches in my collection, so I can't just keep buying and buying, even if I did have a budget that would allow me to do so. So before we jump into these 5 questions that I ask myself every single time, I just wouldn't mind you clicking on that subscribe button if you haven't already done so. It is the quickest, easiest, and free thing for you to do that really makes a big difference to me, and I really do appreciate it if you have already subscribed or if you click on that subscribe today whilst watching this video. But let's talk about these 5 questions that I ask myself. A couple of them are fairly obvious questions, but I'm going to sort of explain them a little bit more about why I do ask that particular question. And the first question is, do I like that watch? And yes, I know that seems really obvious. And generally, it's a fairly obvious thing. I either like a watch or I don't like a watch. But there are a few occasions where sometimes my sort of my thoughts about a watch, my thoughts about what a watch looks like can get distorted. And I want to make sure that I do like a watch if I buy it, because I'm going to be wearing it and I'm going to be enjoying it. And what are those things that could happen that sort of distort my view of a watch? Well, firstly, the thing that can distort it is price. If a watch is on sale, or if it's being sold on the used market, or if there is just a massive discount applied to a watch, sometimes you sort of look at that watch and go, wow, that's so cheap, and you're getting so much for your money, maybe I should just buy it. But if you don't like the look of it, well, yeah, there's no point buying a watch that is heavily discounted, that is great value, if you don't actually like it. And I've almost done this a couple of times when I've thought, wow, that's such a good savings, that's so good value, you get a lot for your money. But then when I really look at it and go, well, do I actually like it? The answer is sort of no. Or it's not enough that I actually want to own it, even if it is a bargain. The next reason sometimes my mind can be distorted in regards to if I like a watch or not is because of the brand of the watch. Now, sometimes we sort of tend to like certain brands. I like certain brands. I do try to keep my sort of mind open to other brands. But when a certain brand comes up at a certain price that you can afford, even if it's not a watch that you really like, sometimes you can go, oh, wow, I can afford that. I can get that. I really want to own a watch from this brand. Maybe I should buy it. But if you don't actually like it, it doesn't matter how good the brand is, don't buy it. Or at least I don't buy it. And I've done this before. I've done this before in regards to Omega. I love Omega watches. I think they're fantastic. But there's a few that I particularly really like, and they're the ones that I'm really concentrate on. They're also completely out of my price range at this point. But not all Omegas are out of my price range. And a few times when I've seen a watch from Omega that I thought, oh, I can afford that. I thought, oh, maybe I should buy it. I can afford it. I could sell a watch. I could then justify paying for it. But then when I ask myself, do I actually like this Omega watch? The answer's either been no or not really. So it doesn't matter how good the brand is or how much you like the brand, unless you like the watch, well, I don't see the point in buying it. At least I certainly don't want to buy it. And the next part of why you might buy a watch that you don't like the look of is hype. There are watches that are hyped up on the internet, on social media, by watch reviewers like me, and sometimes you can get caught up in that hype. And I have been caught up in that hype before, and sometimes I've bought watches that I've actually ended up really liking, and sometimes I've almost bought watches that are in that hype, but I don't actually really love. I've been lucky enough not to allow myself to get too much into the hype, and the couple of times that I have, I've actually ended up with really good watches, because sometimes the hype is absolutely there for very good reasons. It's really hyped up because it's such a great watch, but you still got to like it. One watch that I really sort of was interested in because of the hype was the new Tissot PRX. Lots of hype, lots of positivity. People love it. When I went and tried it on, I thought it was okay. I liked it, but I didn't love it. It wasn't the watch for me. And if I'd allowed myself just to get caught up in that hype, I would have ended up with a watch that, yeah, great watch, but not really something that I really love. And it would have been a lot of money to invest into a watch that I don't really love. And that's not what I'm here for today. That's not what I'm here for in watch collecting in general. I want to buy watches that I love. And the second question I always ask myself is, can I afford it? And yes, again, this is another very obvious question. However, it's a question that really needs to be asked because sometimes, and quite often actually, you can get into a bit of a cycle, especially when you start buying watches. You start sort of seeing watches at certain values that perhaps a year ago you would have thought was expensive, but now you're starting to think, oh, that's really cheap. I might as well buy it. Or perhaps you may end up having a limit on your sort of budget that you're comfortable spending, and then you end up spending over it. And I have to say, in my experience, I have been very strict on myself in regards to how much money I am able to put into watches. And quite often I'll end up funding another watch by selling a watch. And this has actually turned out to be a really big positive for me. Initially, I have to say it did feel a little bit sort of constrained that I was only able to spend this amount of money. But once I got past that and I really thought about it a little bit more, it really freed me up. It freed me to buy watches that I wouldn't normally have bought. It frees me to be comfortable spending the money because I have set a budget. This is how much money I can spend on watches. And I can spend this money freely. I don't need to think too much about it if I don't want to. I don't need to say, oh, actually that should be paying on the house, or that should have been put into fuel in the car, or that should have been on a holiday. Nope. This money that I've set for myself is for watches. So I can be very free and very comfortable spending that money on a watch that I like. So it has really freed me up to allow myself a very strict budget because of those exact reasons. So for me, I'm very careful. I'm very careful about how much money I spend on watches, and I only spend within this budget. I have to also say that on this particular note, occasionally I've wanted to spend over it because a watch has come up that has been, wow, amazing. I thought, oh, I really want that, but it's been beyond my budget, and I've not allowed myself to buy it. And as a result, a watch has actually come up for sale a little bit later that I would not have been able to afford, because if I'd blown the budget early on that bigger watch, this other watch wouldn't have been able to be bought by me, and they've ended up being fantastic watches. So by missing out on a watch that I couldn't afford, I've ended up buying watches that I can afford that I love. So it's worked out quite well for me, and I absolutely live by this: work within a budget and work within a constraint that I can afford. And my third one is actually probably one of the best out of all of these sort of questions that I ask myself. It is when I'm looking at a watch, when I'm looking at the price of a watch, I ask myself the question, what other watch could I buy for the same money? And this is a really good question, because when I'm looking at a watch that I like, I can afford it, well, that doesn't mean that I should buy it. Because even if it's a good watch, even if I like it, even if I can afford it, there might be another watch out there that I like more, that I could even afford more. So I try to think outside of this sort of tunnel vision of the watch that I'm looking at and say, okay, what else could I get for this same money if I didn't buy this watch? Now, I don't go down a long sort of process of spending years thinking about other watches and looking at everything else on the market, because that can sort of take away the gloss of buying a nice watch off the purchase. But there are a few things that I like to do. I think, well, in the sort of Seiko range, and I use Seiko as a bit of a catch-all when I sort of think of like a mainstream watches. I think, what could I get in the Seiko range that I like? I think, what could I get in the microbrand range that I like? What could I get on Aliexpress that I like? If the watch is a little bit more expensive, I'll think, well, what can I get from Hamilton or Tissot or from Longines? And sometimes it stops me from buying a watch, because even if I like it, there's something better, something that I like even more for the same price. So why buy a watch that I like when I can buy a watch that I love? Fourth on the list is a nice, quick and easy one. Will I wear it? This may sound like a weird one, because if you're buying a watch, why would you not wear it? Well, you don't always wear the watches that you buy. If you've got a relatively large collection, you're not wearing all of those watches. And sometimes you can get caught up with a watch that looks really cool, that you like, that you can afford. But if you're thinking about it from the style of the watch, or you're thinking about it in regards to what your collection is it something that you are actually going to wear? Now, for me, there's no point in me buying a watch that I don't wear. I know that we are all different collectors. Some people just like to own watches, and that's perfectly fine. But for me, I have to ask myself the question, am I going to wear it? Because if I'm not, I'd rather invest that money in a watch that I am going to wear. And the fifth question, and the last question that I always ask myself, is, do I need it? Specifically, what I'm asking myself is, do I have a watch in my collection or a couple of watches in my collection that already fulfill that role? Am I looking at a watch that I really like, that I can afford, that I can justify, that I might actually wear, but I've already got other watches that do exactly the same thing? Now, as I just mentioned earlier, there are different types of collectors. If you like all dive watches in your collection and you have 50 dive watches, well, realistically, I guess, that seems like all the sort of similar style of watches, even if they're all very different, they sort of fill that same spot in your collection. But for me, there's only so many of each sort of watch that I need in my collection. As I mentioned earlier, I only allow myself a certain amount of watches in my collection. It's been growing a bit lately, so I'm trying to cap it, but I don't need too many of one style of watch. For me personally, dress watches is the big one for this. I really love dress watches. I think they look amazing. I think there's some amazing watches out there, but I actually don't have that many opportunities to wear a dress watch. So there's no point for me to have 5 or 6 or 10 dress watches in my collection. Realistically, one will do it, and maybe I can push it out to 2. But other than that, why buy another dress watch when I'm not really wearing the ones I already have enough to justify the ones that are already there in my collection? So guys, that's my 5 questions that I always ask myself whenever I'm buying a watch. And it has absolutely helped me when sort of deciding what watches to buy and whether I should buy a watch. It has certainly stopped me buying a few watches that I really liked, but then something in those questions that I've asked myself has stopped me. And later on, once the excitement of that thought of that watch has gone away, I have thought, I'm very, very thankful that I didn't buy it, because realistically, it didn't answer all those questions correctly, and as a result, it would have been a bad purchase. And I probably would have ended up flipping it, and I might have lost money on it. So I'm glad I asked myself those 5 questions. Now guys, I would love to hear any questions you guys ask yourselves when you're buying watches, because I would love to have more questions in my head when I am buying them, so I end up buying even better watches than I already do. But as always, I really appreciate you watching, and I do hope to see you in the next video.